Hi, this is Tim of the 1916 Company. Welcome and thanks for logging on. If you love this watch, email us, Team Mosso at the1916company.com for purchase, pricing, and availability questions concerning this watch. Today, we discuss something that is much loved and discontinued, the 39mm Audemars Piguet Royal Oak Chronograph. This is reference 25960 in rose gold, and according to documentation that comes with this example, it was manufactured in 2011 and sold in Hong Kong in 2013, so we have some time frame context here. At 39mm, I have to say it wears a size or two larger. It really feels like a 40 or a 41, and you'll see that on my wrist. In terms of thickness, well, it's not. 11.2 millimeters, quite slim. The 39mm case, if we're just measuring the case itself, lug-to-lug, it is 49.3 millimeters, and if we measure these intermediate links off the edge, the plots as they're called, then the total distance across the wrist is fairly beefy, 52.3 millimeters. It's a massive watch, and because it has a massive bracelet and a clasp, when it's on the wrist, you really feel the heavy rose gold, full metal jacket sensation of almost like a metal manacle or some sort of involuntary weight program. This could really build some muscles, and you know what? I wouldn't have it any other way, because the feel of a watch that feels as expensive and elite as it is exactly what some people are looking for in a luxury timepiece. But on my 16 centimeter circumference wrist, you can see it's large, but it's not huge. It does wear kind of like a 41, and you'll note that in profile, it's low enough to fit underneath the cuff. The 41 Royal Oak, in contrast, feels more like a 42 or a 43, so Royal Oaks always wear large. I believe you could probably fit this watch on a wrist of 15 centimeters circumference and up, so that's a sort of context in terms of fit. The bracelet's beautifully made. You can see why it takes between 9 and 11 hours to hand finish a Royal Oak bracelet. The intricacy is incredible. Take a look at these plots. You can see their interfaces are polished, and that's the kind of thing you only really notice as you roll it through the light. You'll also see that there are channels between the links to prevent undue constraint in their movement, but also to avoid pinching skin, pulling hair, trapping wrist heat, or making the bracelet unsuitably rigid. In profile, you can see that the satination is vertical, whereas across the top it's transverse, running down across the links. There is a bevel on the flank of the case, and you can see it expands across the lug hood and then extends all the way down the shoulders of the links. And in fact, the integrity of this bracelet and the sharpness of the metal on this watch suggests it's been refinished once or never. It's very intact, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But in terms of physical integrity and the tolerances involved, if you pull the bracelet towards you, like in this case, I'm applying a little bit pressure toward myself. Now I run my finger down the outside of the bracelet. I can't even feel the steps of the taper. It feels just like one smooth sweep. Those are the tolerances to which this is made. Now in terms of the crispness, you can see the micro bevel in profile, the swell of the bevel on the 9 o'clock side as it moves away from the center case, the sharpness of the break between facets, as well as the break between polish and satin. This is an incredibly well-preserved example of a Royal Oak chronograph from the 39mm era. You can see removable links are fixed in place using screws, which I always prefer to springs and bars and sleeves. We'll talk about that in a moment. We have a now discontinued single fold logo style deployant with a single trigger release. Now I talked about pins, sleeves, and springs. What did I mean by that? Well, if you take a look at the bracelet, you can see that it's fixed to the case using screws and bars rather than spring bars. That's a more secure junction. I like to see that on an expensive and heavy watch. And in terms of sizing the bracelet yourself, having screws instead of pins and sleeves means it's easier to just get a jeweler's screwdriver and size this thing without a lot of experience or separate tools. Interesting fact about this case, you could see how coherent everything is with the character lines of the bezel running into the mid-case, running into the case back, the faceting and profile being sharp, the different planes of the bezel being incredibly pronounced and well-defined, the satin-finished outermost, then the sloped, polished mid-face, and then the top of it, which has that top-down sort of cascading brushed finish to match the bracelet, the lug hoods, and you can see how the bezel matches that. In profile, you can see that the micro beveling on the angular crown guards is still remarkably intact and easy to distinguish. You can also appreciate that there are hexagonal forms for the screw downs of the chronograph pushers and the crown, which match the hexagonal white gold bolts, and they are bolts on the bezel. Now, if you take a look here, one of the elements that really distinguishes this as a well-preserved Royal Oak chronograph, see how the bolts are still countersunk and they're below the plane of the bezel? When they draw even with the bezel or they stand proud of the bezel, that is the threshold for bezel replacement at Audemars Piguet. So you always want to see when buying a pre-owned Royal Oak that those bolts are below the plane of the bezel, and indeed they are. And they are white gold. They're not steel, they're white gold, which has a little bit of a warmth to it, but contrasts nicely with the rose gold here. The bezel is a rounded octagon. It was inspired by a vintage diving helmet. Designer Gerald Genta, when he created the first Royal Oak in 1972, drew inspiration for the bezel from a vintage diving helmet. It was not a Royal Navy warship, it was a helmet. You can see that is still intact today. Now, with screw-down chronograph pushers and crown, this does have a 50-meter surface swimmable water resistance, so keep that in mind. Later Royal Oak chronos would eventually adapt screw-down look pushers, but this is the real thing right here. These are not merely crown shoulders. They really do lock the pushers in place. The dial is a Tapisserie, and as you can see, in addition to the pantograph hobnail cut, this one has a lovely sort of nickel anthracite lacquer across its top. When you get really close to these lathe cut dials, you can see all of the tiny textures between and across the hobnails that reveal this to be a incredibly intricate fabrication. And whereas these dials would be cut by Audemars Piguet in-house after 2012, I think when this watch was made in 2011, it would have been Stern Frère, which is a Richemont-owned company that actually has roots with the Stern family that controls Patek Philippe. So that is the era of this dial here. Rose gold hands, rose gold logo, rose gold indices, the idea being those elements will never tarnish or oxidize. Taking a quick look in the dark, it's got plenty of luminescence, no shortage in that regard, with a big index at 12 o'clock to help you get your bearings. And then we have countersunk sub-registers for running seconds, chrono minutes, chrono hours. At center in each, there's an azurage or a concentric pattern. And we have a little date with a faceted window, and there is a quick set for this, though the watch doesn't have a hacking seconds function. More on that in a moment. Taking a look at the reverse side, solid case back, but underneath we have a Frédéric Piguet 1185 doing business as Audemars caliber 2385. Now, this is a high horology movement found on Blancpain, Breguet, the Vacheron overseas chronograph, and the Royal Oak chronograph for generations. So this is a true high horology movement for a high horology watch, and the two companies are actually close neighbors in the Vallée de Joux, out of Les Brassus. So the dial features a quick set for the date, and then the chronograph features a column wheel for crisp feel to the chronograph action, and then a vertical clutch so there's no jump or stagger when you activate the chrono, and because there's no wear and tear inherent in a vertical clutch system, you can leave it running full-time if you wish. Out back, you cannot see the movement, but I will illuminate. It is only 5.5 millimeters thick, which is exceptionally thin, being an integrated column wheel vertical clutch chrono. Only 5.5 millimeters thick, 37 joules, a hand 5-position adjustment, a lot of decorative finish that, though not seen, is a testament to the integrity of its maker. It is a high horology finish as well as architecture. Unidirectional winding, 3 Hz beat rate, 37 joules, 40-hour power reserve. And then the watch itself beautifully preserved around that beating heart. Reach out to Team Mosso at the 1916company.com for purchase and pricing details.